So neurohumanities is one of those things where for some scholars it has been playing with a shiny new toy and applying it to all sorts of fun stuff. And for other scholars it has been a source of skepticism and concern. And so there was sort of something of a backlash against what has been called the neurological turn in literary and cultural studies. And now I think that work is sort of starting to respond to those criticisms and has become sort of more careful and nuanced. And so that's sort of what I want to trace out. Okay, so like I said, neurohumanities is this big broad umbrella. It includes a wide range of things: neuroaesthetics, neurophilosophy, neurotheology, neurofeminism, neurolit, pick your favorite, humanities, and add the word neuro to the front of it. And so let me just do sort of some quick examples, just so you get a sense. We've already seen some from neuroaesthetics and neurophilosophy, but here's some more. So some of these came up earlier at boot camp. So for example, Andrew Newberg and colleagues used SPEC to look at what happens in the brains of Tibetan monks and Catholic nuns while they are meditating or doing intense contemplative prayer, respectively. And they found, interestingly, that even though the beliefs, the goals of these two groups of people were rather different, there were some interesting similarities in what was going on in their brains. So that was focused on a certain kind of religious experience. A different kind of religious experience is something Ramachandran has talked about. So he's talking about ecstatic religious experiences. People become overcome, perhaps they see visions. And he's argued that these experiences can be caused by focal seizures in the limbic system. Likewise, Persinger of the God helmet has claimed to be able to induce religious experiences using TMS to stimulate areas of the temporal lobes. So these sorts of experimental findings in neurotheology have been used to bolster a wide range of conclusions, everything from using this kind of stuff to conclude that these religious experiences are really real, to using these findings to show that religious experiences aren't really real, they're nothing but neural firings, right? So used in all sorts of different ways. Newberg, for one, has cautioned for methodological agnosticism, and that we should not use these sorts of neurological findings to draw conclusions about ultimate causes. And so he says, a brain scan that demonstrates changes in certain structures when a nun experiences being in God's presence could indicate that the brain changes created the experience, or that the brain was reacting to the actual experience. So that the neuroscience, it seems, is not going to tell between those two possibilities, and often that's sort of exactly what people want to figure out, right? Can we use this to argue for the existence or the non-existence of God? So it seems like this kind of work can help us understand the things about religious experience or the effects of religious belief, but it's not going to answer those pressing metaphysical questions. Moving on to another area, this is examples from neurolit crit or cognitive cultural studies. So this is a very new field, I think, as you were saying earlier on. So the literary scholar Lisa Sunshine, I think that's how you pronounce her name, uses the idea of, so she has coined the term cognitive cultural studies And so that's a field where you're using the neurosciences, the cognitive sciences more broadly, evolutionary theory, et cetera, in order to analyze cultural products, literature, film, et cetera. Specifically, she's used the idea of an evolved cognitive capacity for theory of mind to analyze the multiple levels of intentionality in the works of Jane Austen. So anybody who's read Jane Austen knows that she has incredibly complex interior lives of her characters, and so multiple embedded levels of intentionality, like she realized that he thought that she felt that he was beneath her station, is par for the course in a Jane Austen novel. And so what Sunshine and other critics are doing is using this theory of mind as a sort of evolved cognitive capacity to argue that, to sort of analyze how sophisticated the prose of Jane Austen is, and to argue that she was actually doing something different. She sort of took levels of intentionality to another level, as it were. There was some collaborative research at the University of Liverpool that investigated the processing of Shakespearean functional shift. That's when Shakespeare uses a noun as a verb. So for example, he godded me. And so this was a collaboration between people on the English faculty and people on the neuroscience faculty. And so they used EEG, specifically the P600 and the N400, to look at what's happening in the brain when readers confront a sentence like, he godded me. And overall they found heightened brain activity as the brain is trying to sort of sort out how to understand a sentence like that. And just one more example, it's Jane Austen again. Phillips and colleagues used fMRI and eye tracking on subjects while they read Jane Austen to see what brain areas became more active, and they wanted to compare intense, engaged reading versus sort of pleasure reading, skimming the novel. And they found that each style of reading had very distinct patterns of activity, and in particular, close reading engaged a much wider array of brain areas than pleasure reading, and these included areas of the somatosensory cortex and motor cortex. So these are just some examples. And so I think there are some virtues of this neurological turn. It's a way to try to bridge the two cultures gap, the gap between humanistic and scientific approaches to understanding the human and human experience. Some people have argued that the neuro turn saved the humanities from the clutches of postmodern, post-structuralist, and psychoanalytic forms of criticism by moving away from these forms of criticism that seem devoid of evidence and argument, and embracing the hard-nosed sureties and empirical groundings of science instead. There has been some pushback about that, but it's foreshadowing. Okay. Interestingly, some humanists have come to modify their views of nature and brain. So the cultural studies scholar Elizabeth Gross points out that cultural studies has always assumed that nature, and this includes the body and brain, is sort of mere background for cultural elaboration. So we don't need to pay any attention to it. But on the contrary, she finds that nature is not the opposite of culture, but its condition. Then the relationship between them is much more complicated than a binary division implies. So we need to pay attention to nature, including the brain and body, because it's not just this sort of neutral background. And here's Natalie Phillips saying that neuroscientific tools can provide humanists with a richer picture of how our minds engage with art, or in our case, the cognitive complexity of literary reading. Work in literature, music, history, art, and so on can add a crucial qualitative element as well as cultural, historical dimensionality to experiments in neuroscience. So there's virtues both ways. There are also criticisms. And the dreaded R word comes up a lot. So there was a considerable backlash to the neuro turn in the humanities. And one of the main concerns is about the apparent neuro-reductionist and neuro-essentialist flavor of many of these findings. So the worry is that neuroscientific explanations of cultural or literary experience are either going to be overly reductionist, they're going to reduce rich, complex phenomena to nothing more than patterns of neural activation, or closely related, they're going to be overly essentialist. They're going to claim that the neural level is sort of the real, the most essential, the most interesting level of analysis. So, after centuries of work in the humanities, the neuroscientists swoop in and claim to tell us sort of what's really going on, right? That's the concern. Other concerns are that neuroscience explanations don't add anything to the analysis, and this is something that came up in the neuro evidence in law, right? Sort of what does it add question. Todd Cronin is an art history professor, and he raises this concern. He says, if Matisse uses a lot of red and a neuro person says red produced neural firing, what does that tell you? Well, I think it can only tell you that your subject is not dead, and maybe you need to talk to a different neuro person. This also, some of these criticisms, it seems, are based on sort of a straw brain conception of neuroscience, right? Or a not fully robust conception of neuroscience. In addition, there's the charge that neuroscience explanations are too generic or coarse-grained to be illuminating. So the English professor, Jennifer Austen, says, how your brain is firing won't tell you if something is ironic, metaphorical, or meaningful, or if it is not. And Raymond Tallis describes neurohumanist endeavors as, he says, they're overstanding, not understanding, because they're just operating at this really broad and coarse grain. So if, for example, you're interested in John Donne's use of metaphor in The Flea, it seems like neuroscience is just not going to be able to get you that level of literary granularity. And then lastly, the literary critic Arthur Crystal says, with the neurohumanities, we've shifted our focus from the meaning of ideas to the means by which they are produced. So this is sort of just an overview of the kinds of criticisms. Like I said, in general, there's a sense that all these things that humanists have debated and puzzled over for centuries, a neuroscientist swoops in, throws some people in an fMRI, and gets some data and sort of tosses off a shallow but very confident answer to the question. I'm not endorsing that description, I'm just characterizing it. Joseph Dumet is a cultural anthropologist who's written extensively and critically about the culture and power of neuroscience. And in an article in 2016, he issued a challenge for the neurohumanities. So he says, I'd like to raise the stakes and ask for cases where the neuro findings produced something surprising and did not serve as an intriguing but not decisive type of scientific ornamentation, a case where an academic argument or a policy would have been changed had the neuroscience results been different. He goes on to say, neuroscience requires a much stranger view of people and biology than the one it currently has built into its experimental systems. So this was 2016. I think we've heard a lot of cases that I think would meet Dumit's challenge. I think in general that both neuroscientists and humanists working at the intersections of those fields do embrace a stranger view of people, at least in the sense that they're starting to pay more attention to the idea of the brain as embodied and embedded in a cultural or environmental context, and to the activities of the brain both causing and being caused by things in the environment and experience. To Dumit's challenge, I would add some things. I think that neuroscientists and humanists need to work together to understand and challenge each other's vocabularies and assumptions. And this, I think, is more difficult than it can appear, since in some cases, humanities scholars and scientists are using not only different words or unfamiliar terms, but they're really playing different language games, right? They're working with different sets of metaphysical and epistemological assumptions. They also need to work together, I think, to ask the right questions and figure out which methodologies are going to be useful to answer the question. So for example, if you want to understand John Donne's use of metaphor in The Flea, perhaps neuroscience, at least in its current state, is not going to help you out, right? However, if you want to ask whether readers of fiction respond emotionally to the plight of the fictional characters they're engaging with, that's something where neuroscience can be helpful, and neuroscience can find that indeed there are patterns of neurological and physiological response in readers of emotional fiction that are very similar to patterns of affective response in people reacting to non-fictional situations. And we don't need to tell a story about the reader has to sort of temporarily believe that the monster is real or something in order to tell a story about the reader experiencing some sort of fear or something like that. So this is just one case where I think Dumit's challenge is met, where neuroscience can contribute meaningfully to what's been an ongoing debate in philosophy. So here's some other areas where the neurosciences and humanities can inform each other. Some of this stuff has come up in some of the breakout sessions. So neurofeminists and gender study scholars raise concerns about the uses and assumptions about sex and gender in the design and interpretation of neuroscience studies, and raise questions about how to use, understand, and interpret these concepts, particularly given the effects of culture and experience, neuroplasticity, and individual difference. Likewise, disability studies raises questions about the way we talk and use terms like normal, typical brains, and urges us to consider extending the idea of neurotypicality and talk about neurological difference, not neurological disorder. At the same time, as Sunshine has pointed out, this literature needs input from the neurosciences to clarify and constrain the use of notions like neurodiversity, neuroplasticity, which often tend to be overused or overextended. So this is just a quote from an article on neurofeminist responses to neuroscience. This idea that the brain needs to be analyzed in regards to its continuous entanglements with the outer world, cultural and social experiences influence behavior by forming and shaping the biology of the brain. So this is my last slide. Here's where I think progress is happening and should continue to happen. Greater collaboration and exchange, especially discussions about and creating shared vocabularies and assumptions, and that research should be interdisciplinary from the get-go, right? People should be working together to craft the questions, designing the experiments, and interpreting the results. And I think this is starting to happen. The number of Neurohumanities institutes, summer programs, and graduate programs is increasing, and so I'm hopeful that this kind of collaboration will continue.
Cool.